Can you hear me in the back? We're gonna get started. Hi, happy 4 o'clock. We got our speaker series today. Something I'm really excited about this one. Eric and I've been friends for a couple of years. He's the author. His bio is not doing him justice up here, I gotta say. Eric is the most well-known, in my opinion, as the author of The Lean Startup, which is a really important book. I know a lot of people here have read it. Those of you who haven't probably should. It's all about agility, maintaining agility, allowing companies to better understand their customers and run a really agile process across the business, not just in technology, but how do we be agile as a company? As you all know, this is one of my key themes here at Flexport. Eric has since then, well, he's done a lot of things since then. He'll probably tell us a little bit about it, but he's most recently started a company that called the Long-Term Stock Exchange, which I'm very excited about, and excited about enough that I invested in the business. So I do need to disclose conflict of interest there. That will, we hope, create a path for companies to play the long game, which is one of our core values here at Flexport. Play the long game after they go public so that they're not constantly managing for very short-term returns. He'll probably share some stats with us on the amount of high-frequency trading that goes on and how little true ownership there is in our public markets, that people are trading in and out of stock in a matter of milliseconds. So is that even, are you really an investor in that company? Are you just speculating and using technology arbitrage? I think there's a nice path there, because what between Lean Startup and Long-Term Stock Exchange, as I reflect on it, that what we're trying to do with the Lean Startup and a lot of what we try to do here at Flexport is maintain agility, entrepreneurship, empower people as you scale the business, putting these principles in place, something we can learn from him hopefully today on that. But as you go public and you start to get these shareholders that want you to be managing on earnings per share every quarter, which can be a recipe for bureaucracy, and how do you maintain that agility? And hopefully Long-Term Stock Exchange is part of the answer to that. So we've got our format today. Eric's going to talk 15 minutes or so about some of his life experiences, and particularly about Long-Term Stock Exchange, although I've really asked him to help us on the agility question on Lean Startup, some lessons from there. Then I'll do Q&A, and we'll take a lot of questions from the audience. I think we have about 1 hour, and we'll kick it off right now. So big, warm Flexport round of applause for Eric Ries from the Lean Startup.
You're going to do this with me,
LTSE.
right? Yeah, we're together.
Actually, I'm going to let you talk, but I'll try not to interrupt. This bad habit of mine.
All right. Can you hear me? Hi. This is a great turnout. Thank you. Thank you for welcoming me. I still can't get over the idea that Flexport is a big company. That's not in my mental model of what's happening here. When I think about it from time to time, this is not what it looks like. So I'm updating. And this is this is life in Silicon Valley. Many of you have been through this when, things change very dynamically, and it's funny to hear Ryan talk about the need for agility and maintain as you scale. That's probably the like number one topic of conversation of companies of this size, across the whole valley. Everyone struggles with that. And I'm just going to tease Ryan for a second, because most people become entrepreneurs because they hate big companies. They're like, I'm not going to work at a big company. I'm going to start my own company. And I always meet them in the early days. I'm like, if you hate big companies so much, why are you trying to create a new one? And then, of course, it's like, well, but my company won't be like that. And I'm always like, by what mechanism? Through the power of your mind. And I'd like to get serious about it.
Do you have any better ideas for us?
Yeah. But luckily, I wrote a whole book about it, so you can check it out. And so, I'm delighted. That's one of my favorite topics on planet Earth, and it's an urgent topic because if we don't figure out how to build a next generation kind of company and replace many of our legacy institutions with this new form, we're all going to die. So hi everybody. Just, not to say that our civilization is doomed and we're working on the solution here right now, but that is, everyone knows that that's going on, right? Like just checking it out. We can talk about that here at school. Yeah. Okay. So I think the stakes for this are super high. And I didn't start out talking in these kind of like grandiose terms, my whole life. So just backing up for a second, you get a sense of who I am and how I came to be here. I was a software engineer growing up. So if you have that image in your mind of like the kid in their parents' basement, like programming their parents' beige IBM XT that they brought home for work, too many hours a day and not getting enough sunlight, and their parents trying to worry about them. Hi, that's me. That was my childhood was all spent indoors. And I couldn't believe it. I can still remember when I found out you could get paid for computer programming. Did you guys know this? You could get paid. I was like, to me, that's like playing video games. So I was like, you're going to pay me to write program. I couldn't, like, that was like, I felt like I had a cheat code to grown up life that I discovered as a child. So I thought I would be a computer programmer my whole life. And I was actually in school at university during the dotcom bubble, those that remember. And during the dotcom bubble, every magazine, every TV show, like everywhere you looked, it was all of the form, kids in their dorm room, whiz-bang technology, something, something, ... Now they're on the cover of this magazine having made a lot of money. And the ... was always a little bit vague, but I was like, doesn't seem like it could be that hard. I should do that too. So everybody, everyone was starting a company back then. So I did. If you've seen the movie The Social Network, some of you have, yeah. So I had what I like to call the first half of the movie, The Social Network experience. So yeah, we definitely did the stuff where we got all the smartest kids in school to build a startup together, and we totally wrote on those cool whiteboards with the fancy pens and had keg parties, and we did all that stuff. Never quite got to the part where we had to sue each other because we didn't make any money. We didn't know anything about running a business. We actually didn't have any clue what we were doing, and when the dot-com bubble crashed, all you needed to know about the quality of our investors was that they had invested in us. So the dot-com bubble crash was bad, very bad for our investors. They all were instantly gone. So it was a bad situation. But I was kind of bit by this idea that you could use technology like to influence the world today, right now. I didn't have to go like work my way up the career ladder at Microsoft. I could do it right now. So that to me was a very, very seductive idea. And I was like, well, what I'll do is I will move to Silicon Valley after I graduate. And like, just like Mark Zuckerberg, I dropped out of school, but unlike him, I went back and finished my degree. See, good thing the dot-com bubble crashed that helped me finish my degree. So after that, I moved to Silicon Valley. I was like, I will apprentice myself in the world headquarters of innovation to the best entrepreneurs I can find. And I'm going to learn how startups are really done. Because I had self-awareness that I did not know what I was doing. Now I'm going to learn. And so I joined a startup out here. I was probably employee number 30. And this is how we used to build startups. I can say we don't ever do this anymore, but it's not as common now as it was 20 years ago. I joined a company. The company had raised, $50 million for stealth R&D for a consumer product that was going to take 5 years to build. No customers would be allowed to see it during this time, obviously, because otherwise you couldn't keep it a secret. You had to, every copy of the company's business plan was numbered. If you wanted to read the business plan, you had to check it out of the company library and sign it out, sign it back in, lest you take the secret of what you were doing home with us. And we would have these beta test sessions. When we'd have a board meeting, all of our board members and the whole company would like beta test the software. This is virtual worlds way too early. And I remember like being a junior engineer on this team, and I was like, this software is amazing. It's like, guys, maybe we should have some customers like use it and play it, and maybe even like pay us some. And people were like, oh no, you obviously don't understand how to do a startup. And I was like, oh, I guess I really don't. Okay. So I was there to learn, to apprentice myself to these geniuses. So the company had 200 employees by the time the product was ready to launch. Almost half of them were in customer service to be ready to handle the impending deluge of customer volume that we were going to have following our global, worldwide, simultaneous launch. Anywhere you could have a computer. You see how this is going? The people I know who've been in startups for a while are laughing now, and some other people are like nodding along. The nodding along people, that you should be in the laughing. This is supposed to be a funny story about what is inevitably not going to work. This is like not how you should do it. Anyway, to make a very long story short, if customers had read the business plan and did what it said, we would have been fine. And I remember to this day, this is going to come back around to our topic for today. I can remember the forecast in the back of the business plan had this hockey stick shaped growth curve that we were going to be on. And I can actually remember being like 6 months post-launch and being like, this plan is freaking genius. It said that on this date, on this time, on this day, we would have almost no customers and almost no revenue. And we are on time, on plan, on budget. This is amazing. The hockey stick's about to happen. And we're like sitting there waiting for a liftoff, and then no liftoff. We just stayed on the flat part of the hockey stick into the indefinite horizon. I remember getting to the end of that experience and being like, wait a minute, these people don't know anything more about running a startup than I did in my dorm room. we're just burning 2 orders of magnitude more money. And then I was like, well, that can't possibly be right. And so that started me on this journey to be like, there's got to be a better way to build companies. And to make a long story short, I wound up, a bunch of us were refugees from that company. We built this company called IMVU, which is another thing in virtual worlds. And we were just like, for God's sake, we're just going to make new mistakes this time. So we built what we would now call a minimum viable product, although we did not have terminology for this. So we just...
Did you coin that term, or has that been around and you just started using it?
I had never heard it before coining it, although apparently anyone with a Google search and like the archive of academic, like people are constantly finding me some person who used the phrase like in 1976 once.
Okay.
So apparently I am not the first ever to put those 3 words together. So I don't take credit for coining it. But I would have been delighted to use any term for what we were doing, because all of our investors, everyone we talked to was just like, this doesn't seem right. And by modern standards, this story is kind of funny. We spent 6 months on our first product, which we were like, that's a 10x improvement over 5 years. Today, if any of you quit Flexport and go start a company and you don't launch your product for 6 months, like we're going to have words. But back then that was considered like crazy fast. And we practice, what we would now call continuous deployment. So we put code into production like 50 times a day on average once we got up to scale. And that was considered completely heretical and a terrible idea. Just to give you a sense of how much the industry has changed in a short time, when I was like, hey guys, I think we should do A/B split testing on the software to figure out if customers actually use any of the features that we build. Everyone else on the team was like, why? That's like a direct marketing technique. What does it have to do with engineering? And there was no Optimizely in those days, okay? You didn't just go online and grab a library. There was no tools for this. I had to write my own A/B testing library by hand from scratch, including the statistical analysis of which I knew nothing. Like, that's how different building a startup was in those days. So anyway, make a long story short, IMVU was successful, and I was the person in charge for all those years of explaining to people why we did things in such a bizarre way. And I used to think that wouldn't be too hard. People would come in, I'd hire someone, more senior than me, some gray-haired veteran of the industry, or we talked to an investor for tech due diligence, and they'd say, how do you work here? Show me your technical requirements document. And I'd be like, no, we don't do architecture diagrams. We don't do requirements gathering. We ship software 50 times a day on average, and we have this better way. And they'd be like, that doesn't sound right. And what you're supposed to say, I didn't know this. What you're supposed to say is like, yes, sir, I'm sure you're right. As soon as we get your money, we'll be delighted to do whatever the thing you're talking about is. And then like they shake your hand and they go away. But I was so stubborn. I'd be like, no. Come over here and let me show you the evidence that my way is more effective. And like, think about this for a second. Like, hi, I would like to show you the evidence that the thing you've spent your whole career doing successfully has been superseded by some kid. So that didn't really work very well. And I went years trying to figure out, like, okay, I have this evidence. I can see with my own eyes. Our team was supernaturally productive by standards in those days. And we just see that it really worked. And we have now terminology for the things that we did, the ability to pivot, a change in strategy without a change in vision, and to go through the build, measure, learn, feedback loop and all this lean startup stuff. We didn't have any way to explain that stuff. So I became the explainer in chief. Like, that was my job, was to try every possible way of explaining this crazy thing so that people could understand it. And lean startup is not my first attempt, by the way, to make this work. I tried a lot of different metaphors and frameworks and like theoretical constructs, just like, can I get people to understand? And lean startup is the fruit of that labor, which ultimately culminated in me writing a book, which came out in 2011, if you can believe it. So that's kind of like, phase one of my journey and career was writing the book. And then that took over my life. So now I went from like person who programs computers for a living to person who does things like this for a living. It's a strange transition. I'm not quite exactly sure what this is, but I enjoy doing it immensely.
It's a lot of fun. Thank you for coming.
Yeah. So I mean, they're just like, rather than just blabber on, like, maybe just kind of pause there and we can chat about lean startup, and then of course happy to get into some of the later stuff.
Yeah. How much of that lean, we think of lean production, lean manufacturing, Toyota manufacturing system, how much of that like sort of vein of, I think you call it Japanese production, did you actually use and inspire you at your startup versus discovering it along the way? Was this an inspiration? I mean, the term lean is the same.
Yeah, I consciously called it lean startup as an homage to lean manufacturing, because halfway through the journey, I got to this point, like IMVU was like 50 employees maybe or something like that. It wasn't like this, but it was getting bigger. And like my explaining was becoming more and more of a problem in my life. And I was asking everyone I knew, like, got any business books to recommend me? I was like desperate for solutions to this problem. I was like, somebody must have written about this topic. And if you read like Michael Porter's 5 Forces or any of the famous business books, they're all written from the point of view of established companies, every single one. So you read Michael Porter's, it's a great book about corporate strategy, and I don't we'll get into that kind of stuff. But anyway, there's like a whole chapter where he gets into how you establish what your strategy is. And at the end of the chapter, he says, now keep in mind that this strategy framework is just a strategic hypothesis. It's very important to go into the real world and test to make sure the strategy is correct. And I was like, finally, the only topic I'm actually interested in understanding. I'm sure the next chapter will be all about how you do this experimentation. Hooray. And it's like moving on to like strategy in Asia. And I'm like, but wait, hold on, go back. Where do we do the experimentation? And if you read even the original lean manufacturing books, there's one book called Lean Thinking where they have a chapter about if you want to enlist your own employees in continuous improvement, you have to have a rule that you're not going to lay them off as a result of the incredible efficiency gains that you unlock, because you can imagine how enthusiastic people would be to help you make the company more efficient so that they can be out of a job. And it says in passing, so when you do this, the critical thing is to use the extra capacity you free up through this efficiency to build new products to refill the factory to capacity. And I'm like, finally, now will be the chapter about how you use lean to discover what those new products should be in the first place, which is, again, the only topic I'm interested in. But of course, the book is moving on to other topics. That's just in passing because, of course, in traditional manufacturing, like if you make a ball bearing factory, the question of like, what should we use this factory to make, like is technically product development, but that is unrecognizable to what we do, right? Like what size the ball bearing should be. Like there's lots of different sizes they come in. I don't mean to belittle that problem. It's very important that you get it right, but it's not like, hey, I've got a crazy idea for a software company that can do international logistics. What do you think? So it's a different quality of problem that we face. And so what I found helpful in lean manufacturing and that earlier theory is an intellectual framework for concepts like batch size and Kanban and Kaizen. And that stuff is super helpful when you start to adapt it to this question of what is the problem we're trying to solve in the first place. So that, for me, that was the inspiration and connection. And I named it that for that reason.
Yeah. The book that inspired me the most on this, I think also inspired you, is the 4 Steps to the Epiphany by Steve Blank, who I believe was your professor at some point along the way.
Yeah, he was actually an investor in IMVU. Yeah.
And it's really been remarkable to watch the degree to which these things have taken hold, and that now this is how you start a startup and how you go to do customer development and make sure people actually want the thing that you're going to buy before you make it, and have those conversations and get people signing up for prototype websites. I mean, even here, I'm pretty inspired that we've had at least three teams. Always sad when people leave Flexport, but exciting when they go and start a company. We've got 3 of them who have left. All 3 have customers and revenue, and like they left in some of them in the last 6 months. It's just like, wow, the pace at which this has taken hold, and it's pretty inspiring for an early stage. You should be very proud. What are you seeing for bigger companies as we grow? How do we maintain that sort of velocity of talking to customers, getting exposure to the customer, making sure that we're really aligned and avoid kind of falling into the trap? Is it that big companies are bureaucracy because they developed before these models and ways of working came along? Or is it just inherent as you become big that you become a bureaucracy?
Well, listen, that is the universal belief in our society that size equals bureaucracy. And so this is where like my story gets kind of weird, because so I published this book. It becomes this big international phenomenon, and I'm traveling all over the world. I basically feel like I got issued a backstage pass to capitalism to go see how it works. So I used to live in Silicon Valley and be all about technology. And next thing you know, I'm advising people on like how you build a deep sea oil well. And like, there's a whole community of people that do lean startup for national defense. So you want to like talk to me about the Five Eyes like International Alliance, like delighted to talk about that. Like I've been taken to a lot of very strange places where people want to apply lean startup. And the weird thing was, so 2 things happened at once. One, big public companies started asking me to come in and help them apply the framework to answer these kind of questions. But also the first wave of startups that had grown up on lean startup started to get bigger. And those were my favorite phone calls. So like, not to name any of you know who I'm talking about, but not to name any names, like to get the call from like a CEO founder who had like been in one of my workshops in like 2009. And now it's, 5 years later. And he's like, I remember you were talking about like management, something. The stuff I remember is the stuff that fits really nicely on a bumper sticker. So like, I remember minimum viable product. I remember pivots, build, measure, learn. But like, wasn't there something else about like not becoming super bureaucratic? I'm like, why do you ask? It's like, well, it's just so strange that I just had this realization that now that we're like several hundred or several thousand employees, I just had this realization that I'm not sure I actually could get hired to work at this company or that I would even necessarily want to. I mean, listen, being the founder CEO is a really good gig. I enjoy that. But what about the other people? And I'm like, oh, did something happen? Well, yes, as a matter of fact, I just tasked one of my product teams 6 months ago to build this crazy, wacky new thing that we were really excited about. And I said, go forth. Here's the budget. You got a squad. Go make it happen. Keep me posted. And I'm busy. So I get periodic updates about all the projects that I periodically care about. And somebody scores them by red, yellow, green. And this project's been green for months. And I was like, that's great. I got to do the drudgery of my day job, but like my heart is in this project doing this bold new thing to reinvent our whole, that's great. Anyway, then I went to check in with them after 6 months and I was like, Tom, give me the update, guys. How's it going? So I just walked over there. What's the story? And the product manager was like, oh, it's going amazing. All systems green, terrific. We almost have approval to start the like requirements gathering process for the brand architecture for the launch. It's like, what does that mean? I don't understand. And he's like, so what are customers saying about that? And they're like, customer what? He's like, well, what have you shipped so far? And they're like, shipped? We're almost got the meeting scheduled to have the discussion about how we will build the product one day in the like indefinite future. And he's like, what have you been? And and he blew up at the team and they got really upset. And he was like, why did you do it this way? And the product manager is like, this is how it works in your company. You know that, right? You made these rules. I work for you. So isn't this what you wanted me to do? And he's like, did I tell you to do it this way? And he's like, well, you didn't have to tell me. Everyone knows. You can't. And then he started to dig into it. And he's like, well, everyone knows you can't just launch a product without the brand group's approval. That would be very risky. And like, we can't afford to launch something that wouldn't scale. Our scalability team has to wait. And he started to go, and it was like, he was going crazy. And of course he's yelling at this poor product manager, totally unfair. Not that you would ever do that. This is a totally different company. And so we had a conversation about, and it's funny. So I had that conversation with like someone whose company is 5 years old. And then like, that would be in the morning. And in the afternoon, I'd be going work with some Fortune 500 company that's, 100 years old and has 100,000 employees. And the conversations are bizarrely the same. Everyone's having this problem. Everyone's gotten the memo that innovation is important and they're trying to get teams to think in an entrepreneurial way. And then it doesn't happen. And so the question is why? And so the conversation I had, this was a Y Combinator founder. And I remember asking him to recount for me all the ways in which if he had been in Y Combinator and had proposed this plan to spend these 6 months doing no work, like if he had mentioned that to Paul Graham as his plan, how would that have gone over? And he was like, oh man, Paul's a wonderful person, but that would not have gone, right? That would not have gone very well. I would have been really in a lot of trouble. And he's like, now that you mention it, I wouldn't have even dared suggest that plan because like everyone would have ripped me a new one. And it would be like, and I'm like, but how did you know? He's like, well, because we had these weekly dinners and they have the mentor supports and the partners and then we're organized on the demo day. And it's why he's like enumerating for me all the kinds of support he had to keep his thinking focused on the minimum viable product. And I said, great. Which of those forms of support have you passed on to these entrepreneurs that work for you? And it was a long, long pause on that phone. And that's the issue. Now, at least for companies that are driven, still founder-led, you have the benefit of somebody who was there in the early days and remembers what it was like. Like, can I just do a quick show of hands? How many people were present when Flexport was like not necessarily a proven thing that was going to work? Like you can remember when Flexport was not a successful company.
You can all raise your hand.
No, seriously, before we had okay, there's like a few early people here. Okay, how many people joined Flexport in the last 12 months? Haha.
Yeah.
Okay, the people from the last 12 months, they never saw it. They weren't there. They don't know. As far as they know, this company's always been a success. And so there's this like terrible mismatch between the lived experience of founders and the lived experience of the next founders that work for them. And so there's like a set of practices that I've been working with people to develop to try to solve that problem. I eventually wrote another book about that.
What's the role of the CEO in that? I mean, what should I be doing, specifically me? Obviously, there's got to work through the whole leadership team and get everybody being entrepreneurial spirit and encouraging it. But how do I set the bar?
So it starts at, so I'll give you my answer, and then like the people who actually know the answer are all sitting right here. So maybe we'll get some of them to tell us too. I have this like little pyramid there's a book called The Startup Way. So like, in order to maintain startup agility as you scale, what do you have to do? And it's a pyramid. It goes like this. It goes accountability, process, culture, people, in that order. And our natural inclination as human beings is like, if I'm not getting entrepreneurial results, it's because I haven't hired entrepreneurial people. So go get me some new people. Or maybe, I've noticed you guys are good. Like a lot of companies these days are really into the posters on the wall that tell people what to do. And it's like, everyone be more innovative or whatever. Like, don't do that. Like there's consultants you can hire to spray paint, like move fast and break things on your wall. Maybe that's not as popular a slogan anymore.
The hack is that every Trader Joe's has an illustrator.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly.
So we actually, that sign in the back, we sent someone to Trader Joe's and hired their illustrator and brought him in to paint it.
Yeah, that's really good. I like that.
Notice it still says Q2. The dude needs to come back and update it.
Anyway, posters do not make culture. Culture, like the posters reflect the culture that you already have. So, and then process does not make culture, but the culture you have today is the residual artifact of process decisions you made in the past. And the way you hold people accountable is ultimately what determines what process they can and can't use. So like, raise your hand if you're the person at Flexport who's responsible for the next wave of innovations for Flexport. Right. And now raise your hand if you're the person at Flexport who's responsible for your corporate finance. Right. See, when I ask about something that is properly organized in a company, there's only really one thing that happened. One person raises their hand. He's standing over there, right? Because, yeah.
He's lying.
Yeah. It's somebody's job to be in charge of that. So the first thing is like, you guys have a squad system. I noticed as I walked in, so that's good. So you're able to build cross-functional teams that end things. So you're doing the structural piece of the process stuff, at least. That's really good. The next level generally that people struggle with is like, then how do we make resource allocation decisions? How do we judge whether projects are on track or not? Like how do we create a structure where people can pivot? And so I would say the number one responsibility of the CEO and their leadership team is to drive that accountability for the high uncertainty parts of the projects that you do. Like not everything you do is high uncertainty anymore. Some of the stuff you do is simply an execution thing that is related to something you really understand well. And that's not to denigrate it, just to recognize it as a different risk reward ratio than something you're doing that's like, I'm sure you guys are going to get into Bitcoin, drone delivery, immortality, whatever, any day now. And so when you start that project, the rules have to be different for how you hold that team accountable, but a company can't function if it doesn't have an accountability system for every kind of project that it does. Does that make sense? I'm happy to get
accountability and decision rights, ownership, and making sure that's clear.
Yeah, like delegation, right? Single person who's the founder of that team. I think eventually, like if I had your org chart, you said you're 1,200 people, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
So I probably can draw your org chart, and it's probably some version of like a matrix management setup. And so I can imagine what it looks like. And if I were to reincarnate Alfred Sloan, who invented what we call the matrix management system for General Motors in the 1920s, he would be like, oh yeah, I can't believe they're still using that. That's awesome. Like, good job, everybody. But like, I think we can think of some things that have changed in the intervening 100 years that maybe would require like a little bit of updating. So I've tried to make the case for some changes we could make to the org structure of the corporation to incorporate entrepreneurship as a corporate function. So,
what have you seen in terms of like tools for visualizing such an org chart or creating it or making it? There's very little, like all org charts are like, assume you have a reporting line and at most a dotted line, and there's no, how do you visualize a team-based org structure where it's more important what team you're on than it is who's your functional boss in a lot of cases?
Yeah. I mean, the visualization is, no, there are no tools for this. You have to make it up. What I've tried to do though, like so it's an n-dimensional problem where like you guys have different divisions still now, or different P&L areas where you operate. Yeah. So people can kind of really get that a new product within one of those divisions, that's like an entrepreneurial situation, right? If I'm like, hey, I want to, like, I'm not going to do shipping containers. We're going to do it by drone fueled by Bitcoin. You're like, yeah, that's risky. But if I told you that I was quitting Flexport today because I want to create a new IT system and you're going to be my first customer and I'm going to redo whatever ERP something that you guys do, I don't really understand your business that well. But whatever it is, I'm going to redo that and you're going to be my first customer. No one will be like, well, that's a low risk thing to do. Right? Everybody like, well, that sounds great. Good for you. But that's a risky thing to do. Boy, you better. But if I don't quit and I say, you know what, I changed my mind. I'm going to stay here and I'm going to mandate that every person in this company use my new ERP system that I'm going to design and build internally. Most companies are like, oh, that's just an IT thing. That's just like rolling out a new iPhone or something. That's not risky. But I would say it's just as risky whether you do it internally or externally. If you're building something new, you're changing people's behavior, that's an entrepreneurial situation. Then you're like, oh, I know, we're going to buy a startup. That's a great idea. So, okay. But the corp dev team that buys startups usually doesn't talk to the product team that has to operate them after they're acquired in your friend's company. And so if you were in the meeting where those conflicts can arise, you're like, oh, wait, they had two different standards around what progress means for a startup. And now we have an incompatibility. So if you kind of work your way through the org chart, you'll see that there are these entrepreneurial pockets that are happening in a decentralized way. And so having like a common framework, common language, common operating procedure for that work can make it much more effective.
An ability, if I'm hearing, to sort of like score the risk reward or the riskiness of some of these projects, the upside risk of some of these projects, and making sure that you have a good portfolio of bets that's out there and a lot of experiments. And
totally. I mean, everyone I think now pretty much understands portfolio theory is like now pretty well understood. Let me just illustrate with I'll just give you an example from a big public company that you don't want to be like. So I was doing a workshop for a public company and they asked me to fly out to their headquarters and do a workshop for the CEO and his top 200 corporate vice presidents. And I said, sure, I'm happy to do that. But my condition for being willing to do that is you have to first let me talk to some people who work for a living in your company and do some workshops with them. And then I'll be educated enough about how your company actually operates to meet the executives. And they were like, not thrilled, but they agreed. So in the morning, I was coaching individual teams, one squad at a time. And then in the afternoon, I was doing the workshop. And of course, the key to that is you sit down with the executives and you're like, you realize that no one here can make a decision. No one can get, and they're like, that's not happening in my division. So you have to, you have to be able to say, no, I just met so-and-so from your division. And that's what they said. So am I a liar or are they a liar or do you have it right? So and so anyway, I did this thing, the workshop, and I told them the story that I'd heard earlier in the day. There was a team that was building a new distribution channel for this consumer packaged good product. And they had actually secretly done this MVP for like $2,000 a location. They were scaling up and they had gotten to 4 locations. And they were really excited that customers love it and there's a huge waiting list. And I was like, awesome. When are we going to double the number of locations? And they're like, well, I'm just waiting on budget. And I was like, well, how long have you been waiting? And they're like, it's been 6 months. It's like, you've been at 4 locations for 6 months? I was like, what's the problem? He's like, well, I asked for budget and they said, well, great. How big is the opportunity? Because everything has to be scored by ROI. So they need to know what's the ROI going to be. I told them the size of the opportunities. There's like 10,000 of these locations that could be opened if we pursued this aggressively. And they said, great, they cost $2,000 each to open. They're like, right. So they said, you need $200 million to do this project. We're going to do a funding request analysis for your $200 million. Please stay tuned. And that was 6 months ago. And we haven't heard anything back. And so I was pitching this to the executives and they're like, well, yeah, but. And I was like, okay, but hold on. Can anyone in this room please authorize $8,000 for this team to double the size of the experiment? And then can you promise me if that works that we could double it again? Can I get $16,000 for them to do the next thing and the next thing and the next thing? And very few companies like budgeting. We're supposed to talk about innovation now. I'm talking about budgeting. I know it's really boring, but like, what you do in budgeting determines what you do at the higher levels of the stack. So the CEO, of course, the reaction of the executives was like, who told you that story? Where's that team? I want to go fix this. And it's like, hold on. I don't want you to go fire some people. I want you to look in the mirror and now you're looking at the problem. This is your budgeting system. Are you willing to change how it works for the kinds of teams in this part of the portfolio? And for an established company, that's more difficult. I think at your stage, there's still, I would assume, still a hunger to do that kind of thing.
Well, look, we want to make sure we really take a lot of time to learn about long-term stock exchange and what's going on there. Also, this whole conversation is making me sick to my stomach.
Sorry.
we gotta stay agile and not have these things set in. And it happens.
It is preventable. I've seen it with my own eyes.
It needs to be fought tooth and nail, and make sure that all the teams that are acting with good intentions are also thinking about what's the end to end. What's the company look like? What's the customer experience look like? How do we move fast? So thank you for driving that message home. Long-term stock exchange. What is the problem that you saw? What was it that said, because you didn't need to start another startup.
No.
You've done well on your book. You're making money touring around consulting for different.
It has not been a lifestyle upgrade.
It's painful to start a startup. What was it? What was the problem? What was it that got you said, I got to do this again?
Yeah. So I was traveling all over the world. I had this backstage pass, and I've worked with companies of every order of magnitude of size that exist. So from 2 guys in a garage, 1,000 people, 10,000, like to massive, bureaucracies of the scale of which I can barely fathom. And it doesn't matter where I go or who I'm talking to. If I ask people, what is the number one problem that afflicts your company, especially if they're in a public company, the answer is going to be short-term thinking, quarterly thinking. But even in the Valley, if VCs focusing on growth at all costs, and gotta build my company quick to flip, and I gotta follow this trend or that trend, or just this idea that we're in this rush to get somewhere and we don't especially care where we're going. It just seems like it's an epidemic to me. And yet, it's not hard to find out that this is a problem unless you go to talk to the policymakers who build the system, and then they're all like, I don't know, is it really a problem? Maybe it'll fix itself. Maybe it's not a problem. Maybe it's actually secretly for the good. There was just a big SEC just convened this big panel on short-termism and long-termism, and there was someone on there be like, no, historical R&D rates are fine, so there's no short-termism problem. It's like, okay, great. Well, the lived experience of millions of people who feel it is a problem, we can just ignore because we found some stat in a data set. Great. So there's huge blindness to the fact that this is the lived experience people are having, and it causes a lot of misalignment and bad decisions. And of course, I got into this through innovation. If you're in a public company and you have all these innovation projects, and then the company's about to miss its quarter, guess what happens? We cancel all the innovation projects to make the company's earnings per share look temporarily better. But that's like eating the seed corn. It's a fundamentally irrational thing to do. And yet it's a universal practice among public companies. And then I also started watching all these companies run by friends of mine go public, and then you see the before and after. And it's one thing to see it in the literature, like rates of investment in R&D, investment in employees, employee engagement, all those go way down after companies go public on an average basis. Inequality between executives and employees goes way up. Time horizon, buybacks, it's just, the academic literature is just full of this evidence that this is a mess. But then you just see what happened. I don't want to pick on any companies by name, but you have some friends in some of these companies and you watch what happens. You saw it with your own eyes. Yes. I'm not crazy. Some people nodding with me, right? So we know it happens. And yet we in Silicon Valley, we prop the system up. The number of public companies in the United States has fallen in half in the last 20 years. We used to have 9,000 companies. Now we have 4,500. And if you look at the graph, it's just contraction every year. It's a straight line down. You can't even see the dot-com bubble, Great Recession. There's nothing on the graph. It just straight down. So we are sending our best and brightest companies into a system that destroys them, and it requires a steady supply of fresh meat to keep going, and we're the dealer. And then we're like, oh, but Wall Street, what can you do? We have no power. They're all powerful. It's like, no, we prop the whole thing up. If we want something to change, we could change it. So anyway, I wrote about this in my book. If you read if anyone has a copy of Lean Startup, you can turn to the very, very last page of the book. I was like, somebody should really fix this problem. And I wrote 3 whopping paragraphs on how it could be fixed. Someone should create a long-term stock exchange or LTSE, blah, 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 blah. And then I was like, my work here is done. Okay. I wrote a book. I wrote about it.
You're just like Michael Porter.
Yeah. I told everybody that they should do this thing. And anyway, I'm moving on with my life. And if you go back to Lean Startup, every random idea to do any random thing I suggested that somebody should do in that book, in the intervening years, somebody has tried it. I mean, the book sold a lot of copies. A lot of people tried. There's a law of large numbers, except for one idea. No one ever called me and was like, hey, could I do that stock exchange thing? That sounds fun. Let's build an international, globally, financial regulated stock. That'll be fun. No one did that. So it was just an idea that drove me crazy. Why is nobody doing this? Why is this problem? Why are we also blasé about this problem when the planet is on fire and like every social trend you can imagine as being, is getting, like the situation is getting worse and worse and worse by the day. And we know in our bones that we're incentivizing people to do the wrong things, and yet we're all acting like there's nothing you can do about it.
So the problem's, I think, pretty clear. The amount of short-termism that's in the market, where it's a benefit for us as a private company. Often we think to compete with public market competitors that are managing for earnings per share and looking at a quarterly, how good can we make the results this quarter? Don't do anything that's going to lower earnings per share, because that'll lower the stock price, and that's how they get compensated.
Totally.
One of our competitors, who I will not call out by name, but is for the last 3 years, and we're winning deals against this company all the time in the market. And for the last 3 years, they've returned 110% of earnings to shareholders in the terms of dividends and buybacks. And you're sort of like, how they clearly know that we're here and we're being effective. We're winning deals against them, but they're not stopping to say, hey, let's play the long game and really make some technology investments and try to hold this off. So I see the problem. Tell us a little bit about solution, because holy crap, to be in minimum, what is the minimum viable product for a stock exchange?
Yeah.
It's not pretty.
No. Well, so, and listen, I don't know. I actually don't know the name of the company you're talking about, but I can tell you everything about their executive compensation policies.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's
so
earnings,
I know exactly how those executives.
Earnings per share, and if you have earnings, kind of hard to make it go up. There's some
the denominator
mechanisms
go down,
but the per share is pretty easy. You just buy back some shares, and bam, your earnings per share went up.
Sure. There's research that in a given quarter, if the CEO or CFO of a public company happens to have short-term stock options vesting in that quarter, R&D spending is going to be lower and buybacks will be higher, statistically speaking. But it's just a coincidence. So like, why do we allow that? Like, what social purpose does that serve? Well, and like, who's benefiting from that other than the executives who are, whose average tenure is now down to like 3 years, I think. So they're not going to be around to reap the benefits or the consequences. So like, they're acting perfectly rationally, but why? Why do we think this is a good idea? So anyway, to answer your question. So we have built a new national securities exchange. We're in the same regulatory category as NYSE and NASDAQ that is designed for this next generation of companies. So we have built it for you. And the idea is that when you inevitably do go public, I know you're not in any rush.
Inevitably, yes, thank you.
But like, it is going to happen. You're on that path. It is required by law to happen. So it's not if, but when. How can we maintain the culture, the long game, the values that you have as a company? How can we maintain that into a public company despite the fact that these other forces exist? And so we have embodied a set of principles in our listing standards that are about thinking in generational terms, that are about being multi-stakeholder in your approach. So, everyone I think in this community understands that you serve investors best by serving customers and serving your employees and your communities and your partners well. That your competitor doesn't seem to understand that. And so they're just wasting money. But think about how different the world would be if they actually truly internalize that. And that I think in this next generation of founders and employees, we want to build products that are healthy for human beings and the societies they inhabit. And like, I don't think we should have to say that, but as an industry, we seem to have gotten confused on this point recently. So that sounds very vague, I understand. But what we have done is we have translated each of those principles into a series of operational mechanics that have the effect of changing how companies are governed at the board level, at the executive level, in terms of their relationship with their shareholders, so that they and their long-term investors can pilot the ship in this, more sustainable way, even as the company grows and scales. I'm happy to answer technical questions about it.
One of the principles, as I understand,
sort of a high-level one.
One of the principles, as I understand, is that the longer an investor holds their shares, the more voting power they get. What is that mechanism? How does that work exactly?
Yeah, so this is a good example of, let me show you how we translate a principle, a high-level principle, into a detailed operating procedure. So the principle is, like, can you imagine running this company if you didn't know who your investors were? Like, honestly, think about how much time we spend in Silicon Valley obsessing about getting the smart money onto our cap table and how like calamitous it is if you have the dumb money on your cap table. I've lived it, man. It sucks. Now imagine I'm like, okay, now you have to run the company, but I'm gonna blindfold you. I'm not gonna tell you who's on your cap table. I'm just going to randomly put people on there. I might change it at any time. Like, you cannot run a company that way. It's crazy. And yet that's how most public companies work. most shares of stock are held in what's called the street name, meaning that you know that Morgan Stanley is holding a block of your shares with somebody. But like, that's like knowing that like Sand Hill Road has a block of your stock. It's like, it actually really matters which guy on Sand Hill Road is on the other side of that transaction. You need to know that. And yet most companies don't. They literally, one of my hilarious tidbits, most companies pay for a service that is called stock surveillance, which combs through regulatory filings and can tell you after a 90-day delay who is likely to have held your stock 90 days ago. Which, listen, that's better than not knowing anything. But I can tell you story after story after story, hilarious stories of companies that like meet with one of their largest investors and like, that meeting went really weird. What's wrong? And then they find out 90 days later that the person had sold their whole position in the company like 3 days before and didn't bother to tell them. So like, how can you run a company that way? If there's a really important strategic decision that it's going to require sacrificing the short term for the long term, who do you talk to about that? Right, so we solve that problem. So that's the principle. The mechanism is we create software at the exchange level that allows companies to know in real time who the short-term investors are and who the long-term investors are and track that ownership. And then we allow the company to provide rewards that incentivize long-term holding, like, increasing vote, right? Because like most Silicon Valley companies these days are dual class organized, where investors have absolutely no say in governance. But like, that is a literally medieval solution to the problem of leadership succession and has its own problems attached to it. So it's like way better. You'd be way
medieval in the sense of sort of monarchical. I've wondered what's going to happen with Zuck's children. Will they become the,
right, do they inherit
the king of Facebook, the king or queen?
There's two solutions to this problem, and they're both terrible. One is you pass it on to your children, and we all know what happened. You've seen those TV shows. Or I'm like really trying hard not to make a Game of Thrones joke. Or you don't do that. Some companies have what's called a sunset provision, where one day, a given day, the dual class protections disappear. So it's like you've been king, you're king, and then like on this day, now like activists run the company. And like since you've announced in advance what the date is, people can plan for that date and bad stuff happens. So it's like it's a real mess. So I don't think even we in Silicon Valley can really justify like perpetual aristocratic governance with no ability for the public to participate. Like, who can really defend that from first principles? But on the other hand, today under standard governance, people can borrow money and buy extra votes like for that day. And then they get their votes count just the same as Warren Buffett's votes. Like that can't be right either.
That one day per year they own the shares and then they're out.
Yeah, literally like you can own the shares for 10 minutes on that day and that's good enough. So like there's got to be a better way. Now I happen to think that we live in a constitutional republic still. So that's a pretty good model. How about we have the citizens of the republic operate by different rules than the tourists and not ban tourists? That seems counterproductive for now. And in a public context, let's like really double down on the citizens are the ones who have a stake in the outcome. Let them have a greater role in governance. So that's the kind of operational mechanism you can build out of the primitives that we create in the exchange.
I love that. I have one question, then we'd love to take it from the audience. My one big question is sort of, I'm all in. I love the idea of great governance and reward long-term shareholders, get a better structure that doesn't require me to become a monarch and my children, as much as I would like that to watch my future daughter become CEO. I can see why you're rolling the genetic lottery every time. What though is the cost? What's the trade-off? And it may be too early to know, but what's the haircut on valuation that I'm going to take from doing such
this
a
is
thing?
This is the question. So now we'll answer a question that consumed 5 years of my life to gain this secret answer. It was not easy. I had to climb the highest mountains and answer the 3 riddles, and it was very difficult to find the answer to your question because I spent many years telling CEOs like Ryan, don't worry, if you go public on LTSE, your IPO will have almost the same level of liquidity as a conventional IPO on the New York Stock Exchange. And all anyone would ever say to me is like, did you say almost? And I'd be like, no, it's like 99% the same. And they're like, so it's not the same. And it's just like, it's a complete non-starter. You can't afford, he's got many of your, future net worth in his hands. So we can't mess around with that. We can't take a discount. We can't risk the possibility that stock won't be liquid and people won't be able to sell. That's a non-starter. So we have found a way to convince the SEC that we should be allowed to operate in the same economic system, like the same plumbing as NYSE and NASDAQ. And that means when you list on LTSE, your stock can still trade freely across every pool of capital in the world. including dark pools, ECNs, ATS, everywhere. And we're so integrated that you can even dual list. You can go on NYSE and LTSE at the same time. You can still go ring the bell if that's what you've always wanted to do. Or you can have that cool party in Times Square. I swear that's actually the decision process most companies go through. Which of those two things would you rather have? So like, which free toaster you like better? Like, either one, go nuts. I'm sure we'll have our own bell or something too. But like, you can get the benefits, the governance benefits of LTSE without having to sacrifice any liquidity. So we found a way to accomplish that. And on May 10th of this year, the SEC gave their approval to our application. So we are now an SEC-approved national securities exchange.
Congratulations. That's an amazing feat, because building a startup when day one, in order to launch your product, you've got to get the SEC to sign off. I've been there with customs. It's not easy. Well, let's give a big round of applause to Eric. Thank you, Eric, so much. A real inspiration. I'll have to bring you back to learn about all the bureaucracy I don't know about, and then come and report it to me.
We'll chat, yeah.
All right, thanks everybody.